Let me set the scene for you. An inspiring Pokemon trainer known as Ash Ketchum is seen sprinting across Pallet Town, utterly disappointed to find himself late to a meeting with Professor Oak. Discovering that the Bulbasaur, Squirtle and Charmander he had been dreaming of travelling across the Kanto region with the night prior had been given away to trainers that arrived to the Professor's lab earlier that morning. The Professor, seeing this trainer's disheartened woes, along with his own decision to, for some reason, only keep one of each starter Pokemon, does he decide to offer Ash an alternative. He offers the young trainer the electric mouse Pokemon, Pikachu. Now, this got me wondering, do other professors keep backup partner Pokemon for budding trainers? And if so, what are the 4th starters of every region? So to begin with, I'll be using details from the games to figure out what that Pokemon could be. While we have no idea where Oak acquires the 3 classic Kanto trio, we do know where he can go and catch a Pikachu, at a level similar to the other 3. Travelling by foot across Route 1, then passing through Viridian City, and heading into Viridian Forest, between Route 2, with patience and some luck, would he find, running through the grass, the Pokemon with the lowest encounter rate, Pikachu. With this information, here's how I'll be determining what every region's 4th starter could be. From the location where the Professor has his or her laboratory, they must travel one route, then go through a town or a city, to then finally catch a Pokemon in the next route with the lowest encounter rate. Now, I could say that they would have to go into an additional area, like Route 2 into Viridian Forest, but due to the forest having 2 different entrances leading back onto Route 2 on either side, I will be saying that Viridian Forest counts as being part of that route. As Oak could make this journey by walking, I will be excluding any uses of any HMs to access other areas. Lastly, if one or more Pokemon share the lowest catch rate, then I'll bring up both as candidates, but give reasons as I would choose one over choosing the other. We can even use Oak as an example before moving to our next professor, because Oak does have another choice that isn't Pikachu. If Professor Oak decides to take a left at Viridian City and move his way onto Route 22, he would have a 5% chance of finding either a male or female Nidoran. Now this does depend on which version of the game we go off, which is why Pikachu is still my pick as his 4th starter, as its encounter rate is the same regardless of the version. Though I prefer the Nido line as they have 3 evolutions in their entire line, unlike Pikachu. Well, that is until the next generation rolls around. Professor Elm, from the Johto region, residing in New Bark Town, would take a left through Route 29 and make a choice. Following our rule set, he ignores Route 46 and instead goes into Cherry Grove City, then heads north to Route 30. Only in Pokemon Crystal version can the Professor find not 1 but 3 Pokemon with a 5% encounter rate, these 3 being Weedle, Hoppip and Zubat. While all 3 have the same number of stages and evolutions, and Hoppip being introduced in the Johto games, I would instead pick Zubat as Elm's choice of starter. This is due to 2 features added in Generation 2. Not only does Zubat become the hardest to encounter between the 3 when we consider the day and night cycle, as the other 2 can be battled in both morning and throughout the day, while Zubat is and only can be encountered during nighttime. The second reason is the addition of the Friendship evolution, letting your Zubat go into a Golbat and finally into a Crobat with a high enough friendship. Personally, I like the idea of a professor handing a Pokemon to a trainer that can only reach its final stage by growing a strong bond and trust with their starter. Of course, Elm couldn't use Surf to travel into Route 27 due to excluding HMs, so no water traversal will apply to any other professor throughout this. Now, speaking of water, let's head over to a region which some would say has a little too much. Residing in Little Root, Professor Birch would have to go through Route 101 without getting mauled by a wild Pokemon. Then once in Oldale Town, has the option of heading north to Route 103 or west towards 102. Heading north wouldn't provide Birch with anything too exciting, with the rarest find being a Wingull at 10% in Ruby and Sapphire. Meanwhile, Route 102 has some more interesting and scarce encounters. Now if Birch felt like being a copycat and took inspiration from Wally, the fourth starter could be the Psychic type Pokemon Routes at a 4% encounter rate. But what if he wanted to try just a little harder? Well, depending on the version, Birch could have two choices to bring back to Littleroot. If we follow Ruby and Sapphire, the Professor would take back a Surskit, while in Emerald he could find a Seedot. Both Pokemon have a slight encounter rate of only 1%. Now out of the three, who would I choose? Well, Psychic being weak against both Dark and Bug types makes Route the undeniable worst option here, while Surskit only has 2 stages throughout its line. So, for Professor Birch's fourth pick for the Hoenn starter, I would say Seedot, even if it does mean there are now 2 grass types to choose from. All our former professors have held their labs in the same town as our protagonists. Our next one is the first of a few to conduct their studies away from our trainer's home. Professor Rowan, residing in Sandgem Town, would have 3 paths to take once leaving his lab. However, directly south is Route 219, a route where Pokemon cannot be encountered by simply walking around. So he could either go west towards the trainer's hometown, or head up north, heading to Jubilife City. If he was to head over to Lake Verity, our selection of Pokemon is limited to only a Starly or a Bidoof. Luckily, due to the rules, this location is not allowed, as Rowan isn't passing through a town or a city before venturing to the lake. Now he could stop into the starting town of Twinleaf, but that's not the same as having to go through it. So, Rowan must head north to Jubilife. However, upon arriving, Rowan finds himself at a crossroad once again. We'll need to narrow down our search as the Professor has 3 routes to traverse. Luckily, Route 218 only has Pokemon found in grasses past the surfing section, so this route is removed by the no use of HMs. Weirdly though, both routes 203's southern section and 204 share almost the same list of catchable Pokemon, with both having their rarest finds being either Subats at nighttime or Cricketots within the morning, both with a 10% encounter rate. As we already had a Zubat in Gen 2, we'll just go ahead and say that Rowan would take back a Cricketot as the 4th starter. Is what I would say, but Rowan could have more options if we use a newly added feature for the DS games. After gaining the National Dex and inserting a GBA cartridge into your handheld, the player, and in this case the Professor, can encounter new Pokemon in certain routes. Routes 203 and 204 happen to fall within these areas. This feature absolutely explodes Rowan's choices, adding Caterpie, Weedle, Pinecone, Lotad, and Seedot to both routes 204, while 203 excludes the Viridian Bug duo. All of these Pokemon can be found with a rate of only 8%, making them rarer finds. Now you can find a Curlia with a 1% chance if you're using the Pokeradar, but because it's a middle stage Pokemon and not a Pikachu, it gets the boot in my opinion. To conclude, for the Sinnoh region, Professor Rowan has an ample amount of choices to pick from. If we go off what he can find before completing the league, then I would say he would bring Cricketot back to his lab. However, if he has the National Dex, and being a professor, I imagine he would, then I would personally like him to take Lotad, as we already had Seedot from a prior generation in this video. This generation was a little more complicated than the others, but sometimes things can't simply just be black or white. Speaking of which, Generation 5. Professor Unova, residing in Uvima Town, makes the simple trip up through a cumula and catching her 4th starter in Route 2. However, with no forest stuck between either side of the route, she just has to make do with the route itself. Well, in the first games anyway. Route 2 is lacking in Pokemon for Juniper to bring back with her. In normal grass, the rarest Pokemon she could catch would be a Purloin at 20%. However, if the professor uses the newly added feature of rustling grass, then she could end up with an Ordino. Granted, it does have a 100% encounter rate, but due to only being found through this method, I feel like I could make the argument that it's more of a unique find compared to a Purloin. In the sequel games, however, the professor doesn't move, meaning that she again ends up on Route 2. The Pokemon she can now obtain are more diverse and a bit more scarily higher level, especially to hand over to a beginning trainer, but I guess that teaches them to work harder and not be late to important meetings in the future. Through normal methods, the Pokemon given to the trainer would either be a Jigglypuff or a Lickitung at 10%. We'll be ignoring the rustling grass this time around, as the rarest Pokemons now are final evolutions, which would only make the new trainer's job that much harder to deal with. In spite of this, there is a different method that Juniper could use on Route 2. Peering into nooks through the trees, she could squeeze through, finding herself inside of a hidden grotto. It is here where the professor's best catch would be a Grand Ball at 1%, but because it is a final stage, we will ignore it like the others. 2 Pokemon can be found here nonetheless, that, except for their levels, would make for much better companions for a starting trainer. Those Pokemon are the variations of Nidorans at 2%, so only slightly easier to find than a Granbull. So for Generation 5, I would want Juniper to take an Ordino for the first games, and a Nidoduo for the follow-ups. As for which Nidoran, maybe it depends on which version the professor is from. Now while I could make a transition for the next professor, I don't believe he deserves it. As going through this video, I failed to see that the rule set that I had made out was going to bite me in the beehive when it came to Professor Sycamore and his lab in Lumio City. So as stated from the beginning, the professor can travel in any direction from their lab, as long as HMs aren't required. Lumio City is connected to 5 routes, which then can branch off into further routes due to the rule set. Sycamore has so many options to choose from that instead of going through each option individually, I'm just going to skip that and show you the Pokemon he could end up with and where he would find them. So with that mess out of the way, which one would I consider to be his 4th starter? Well, seeing a Pikachu with 5% follows old classic Oak's option. But with so many other choices matching the same catch rate, the rarest find would be Flabebe, the white variant specifically, with it also being the newly added fairy type to the generation that would give it more ground, in my mind, to be picked. However, we also have Riolu, Pinsir, and Heracross, which all received Mega Evolutions, the new game mechanic for this generation. And finally, there are also Horde battles to consider, which was also added to the Pokemon series in X and Y. I jokingly did want to give it to Dunsparce, as they show up in more than one of the charted routes, but decided to actually think the matter over. So with considerations to all the factors in these choices, those being encounter rate, new types, Mega Evolutions, and Horde battles, 2 Pokemon tied with having the most points in combination. Those two Pokemon being Flabebe and Klefki. Flabebe scored 2 points for being a fairy type and having a encounter rate of only 1%. Klefki got here by having the also newly added fairy type, but for also being encountered in horde battles on Route 15. So for Sycamore's fourth choice, I've decided that he would either get himself a Flabebe or a Klefki. Or the professor would just give you the Kanto starter that he would normally give to the trainer anyway. I don't know anymore. I should really calm things down after that mess of a region. So you know what? Why don't we just head over to Alola and relax with Professor Kukui. Now his lab is located in Halawi outskirts, which is part of Route 1. As for some routes in this generation have subsections to them. These additional sections bring into question if entering a new one counts as a route being traversed. I decided to go against this and will consider new areas to be determined by loading screens. With this, Professor Kukui doesn't have many options to travel. Heading north takes him from Route 1 into Route 3, and then around onto Route 2. Because he doesn't pass through a town, this path is invalid. It would be fine if Iki Town connected onto Route 3, but it doesn't. So going west is the only option. But now some more questions are thrown our way. If the professor starts on a route, then does he have to go through another route before reaching a town? This is why I brought up the loading screens earlier. You see, once we leave the outskirts and head west, we hear our first fading screen as we pass the trainer school, counting this as a route. Then we walk into the beachfront of Hau'oli City, which is a part of a city, counting it towards our goal. Now even though some might say it shouldn't count, because the professor has crossed the beachfront, could he make his catch in the shopping district? Some will say no, as it's more of the town than the beachfront, and he would have to go north onto Route 2. But I think this is far enough for the professor to travel. And across all the Alola games, there is only one Pokemon who I think fits Kukui's fourth starter. Alolan Grimer. Depending on the game, Grimer has the same encounter rate as a Pichu or Wingull. They also have the bonus of being the newly added region form variant. But here are the Pokemon he could get if you really believe he should have gone onto Route 2. Pokemon Sword and Shield, with Professor Magnolia, whose lab resides in Wedgehurst. If she were to head south through Postwick into the Slumberling Weald, here the professor can find either a Grubbin at 5%, or even a Galarian Stunfisk also at 5%. Granted, it would be at an extremely high level to give as a starter. These are my options that the professor can take, unless we consider her taking her travels across the rail instead. While yes, she isn't walking to go there, she isn't also using a HM. If so, she can end up at the meetup spot and go into the rolling fields of the wild area. Here she'll find more interesting and tamer Pokemon to give to a budding trainer. Now encounter rates can change in this location depending on the weather, so I scanned through all the possible Pokemon found here and picked 2 with the lowest rates. Those 2 Pokemon being Tyrogue with 5% across the board unless it's cloudy, at which point it jumps to 28%, but when the weather is as such, Magnolia could find a route with only a 2% encounter rate, having the lowest rate of all the Pokemon there. So for this professor's 4th Pokemon, I believe that while Stunfisk would make for a good option, for the same reason as prior generations, with the wild area being one of the newly added features to this game, I feel that the Pokemon should come from there. Which Pokemon she gets, I guess that just depends on the weather. And considering this region is based off the UK, she'll always get Tyrogue, as it's always raining. Most likely though, the trains just won't run. So I hope you enjoy a Grubbin or a Stunfisk you can't control. Finally, with regards to the newly released Scarlet and Violet games, I'll be honest, while digging through for information, there really isn't much on the encounter rates for any of the Pokemon in any of the areas around, well, any of the region. Because of this, there's just so many possibilities that I'm just not going to cover it this time around. However, if by some chance this video is favoured by the YouTube algorithm, and there seems to be enough interest, I'd be more than happy to make a follow-up video, covering not only Scarlet and Violet, but also Legends, and maybe even some of the spin-off games. But feel free to drop a comment below on what you think the fourth Pokemon could be for not only those games, but any mentioned throughout the video. And there we have it, all the mentioned professors' fourth choices for any Slowpoke trainers who didn't make it in time for the first 3. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave a like. If you didn't, leave a dislike and yell at me about how I'm wrong. Until next time, I hope you enjoyed the show.